right at the beginning, I just wanted to tell you I am not an expert in therapeutic horticulture. However, when I was in my master's program, I did research it for about a year to think about pursuing a degree in horticulture therapy. It's still at the back of my mind. But today, what I wanted to do was to share with you some fairly recent research-based studies that validate just how valuable therapy with nature is. So, have you ever considered that nature is a healing therapy, that it has value? From the looks on the slide, it looks pretty promising, doesn't it? And we've all heard that saying that there's nothing out there that's free, but it looks like you could actually have value in nature, and it is totally free. Next slide, please. So, how do you feel when you hear the gentle sound of rain? And I'm talking gentle, not thunder and lightning. It sounds really nice, doesn't it? And it can really lull you into wanting just to take a nap, right? Next slide, please. And what about bird song? Do you like to hear birds singing early in the morning? I know I do. And I often like to watch this little wren as he's trying to build a nest, and he's calling to a mate to go, hey, look, I got a nest ready for you. So it's really nice to see that, or even to watch the birds as their young hatch going back and forth, back and forth. So it's really nice just to spend time outside doing that. Next slide, please. Or walking in the woods. I particularly like to be out to smell pine trees, to smell that earthiness that you smell when you're in a forest, or to walk through a really nice meadow of flowers or a botanic garden and be able to smell flowers, especially peonies, my favorite. Next slide, please. And to see and hear water as it just laps along a beach or alongside of a boat. So when my sons were smaller, I had a cassette, so I'm dating myself, and it was just the sounds of waves, and it was just washing up along a shore. And if you're a parent, you know children never want to take a nap. They will go kicking and screaming, I don't need a nap. But as soon as I would put that cassette on and make them just be still, within a few minutes they were out. And you never heard a peep from them until they were ready to get up. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some scientific research about therapeutic value of nature, and we're going to start looking at it from way back when. So this is not something that is new. This is something that is actually very, very old. So early civilizations looked at the value of nature. So the temples of Asclepius, who was the god of healing, they were located in natural settings that had fresh air and pure water and trees. So they realized, even cultures older than the Greeks realized, that being out in nature was therapy. Next slide, please. So when we think of Hippocrates, we often think of the father of modern medicine. But one thing that he was concerned about was the whole person. So he looked at how do you heal the body, the mind, and the spirit of someone. And what he thought and what his prescription was, which is still valid today, is to go out into nature, that is just as healing as what we would think of now as having to go to your doctor and get a script. Next slide, please. So the Romans, you can see from this drawing, when they designed their homes, it was more of what we would consider an open floor plan. Usually there was a courtyard centered in the middle of the home. They would have trees planted for not only shade, but also for food, like dates or figs. Also, they usually were walled. One reason that they had the walls was to keep people from coming and taking their herbs or taking their vegetables. So this provided a very nice, restful place for those inhabitants to spend time in. Next slide, please. Now, when we look from the medieval to the Renaissance periods, we start seeing walled gardens very, very often. Usually this was a time of a lot of civil unrest across the whole country. So the monasteries, convents would often have these big, huge walled gardens. They also were places of learning. So the monks or the nuns would often have knowledge of how healing that the herbs were. So in order to protect everything, of course, they had walls. So someone wouldn't come in the middle of the night and take things like the herbs. Also, some of the plants that they used were basically for dyes. And a lot of the hospitals and the infirmaries of those times were often in settings where there were gardens. Next slide, please. So when we start looking at the 19th century, and I know we've taken a big leap here, this is a picture of Central Park. Frederick Law Olmsted was the designer. He very strongly believed that nature was the best medicine. And who could disagree with him when you have something as pretty as Central Park smack dab in the middle of New York City? Next slide, please. Dr. Trudeau is a very interesting person. When he was young, he took care of his older brother who had tuberculosis. And it was just a short time later that he himself came down with tuberculosis. He had become a doctor, he had a wife, he had a small child, and he decided he was going to go out into the wilderness and he was going to just spend the last days of his life there. But miraculously, he actually got better. And he realized then that what was very restful to him, the fresh air, just rest, just having good food, just a little bit of exercise if he felt like it, actually restored his body. So this little cottage here, it's actually called Little Red, was the first cottage that he built for people to come and spend time that had tuberculosis. So he actually had a sanitarium. You'll notice it has a front porch on it. He also built cure chairs, which would be the equivalent of our lounge chairs that we have nowadays. Next slide, please. So when we get to the 20th century, we're looking at interdisciplinary fields. So environmental design or human-centered design. We look at stress management. So we're looking at a lot of issues that weren't prevalent back in the days of these other individuals that we've just talked about. But we started realizing that some of the interventions had a nature aspect to it. This is actually Palo Alto Medical Center in California. You can see, looking right out of those windows, there's a nice garden. If you notice over the top where the doctors and the nurses are walking, it looks like leaves that cast a really nice shadow as they're walking past. We have also found that usually medical centers find that meditation gardens or nature pictures on walls are something that are very healing and soothing to their patients. So this is a new, if you want to call it, science. Next slide, please. And I want you to note the name down at the bottom, Ulrich, 1984. Roger Ulrich was probably the leader in human-centered design, especially for facilities like hospitals. What he did, and he did multiple studies, but this was the earliest one, and everyone in horticulture therapy or therapeutic nature knows his name. He had done some work with Texas A&M. What he found was when he took groups of people, he did one with gallbladders and he did another with heart patients. He found that if you showed them the view of nature, like a tree, as opposed to a patient who had a room with a view of a brick wall, the one that had the view of the tree usually stayed in the hospital a day later. Also, they didn't complain. They didn't need as much pain meds. And they were basically a lot nicer patient. Now, the ones who saw the brick wall, they wanted more meds. They were in terrible pain. So this made him think about, well, maybe we are designing these buildings in a way that does not promote healing. Next slide, please. Do you have a fear of going to the dentist or the hospital? Now, if you were a patient and you walked into a place like this, you would probably forget where you are, and you're going to probably go over there to that fish tank and start watching the fish. And then you'll realize when they call your name, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be here. Oh, they're going to go refill my tooth. But this creates a much more relaxing atmosphere, not only for the patients, also for their families or parents, but also for the hospital staff as well. You would rather a view like this than just a very sterile walls. Next picture, please. Here's an even better example. Look at all of those fish in there. So if you're looking at that, hey, the dentist can just drill away because you're not paying attention to what they're doing. Also, when you have been able to look at this, it reduces your blood pressure, your heart rate. You're not as anxious, and you feel much better. And so by the time you get ready, wow, you're done. And you go, wow, was I here? Next slide, please. So one of the studies has realized that you only need 3 to 5 minutes of nature to start feeling better. Whether it's the views of flowers or trees, whether you are anxious, you're not going to be as anxious just being able to look at a view of trees. You probably stand 3 to 5 minutes in line waiting at Starbucks to pick up your coffee, or in the drive-thru. Your wait nowadays might be a lot longer. But when they looked at the physiological changes in these individuals, their blood pressure was lower, their muscles weren't tense, their heart activity was so much better. So they're starting to look at this and realizing, wow, maybe this has some value to it. Next slide, please. So then we start looking at a nature pill prescription. So this was a study. So they evaluated about 30 participants. They asked them to spend 20 to 30 minutes out in nature, let them do whatever they wanted to. And then they looked at stress biomarkers. So it's salivary cortisol and salivary amylase, alpha amylase. And what they found were both of these stress markers were reduced by 20 to 30 minutes of exposure to nature. More didn't help, less wasn't good enough. So 20 to 30 minutes. Most of us, we might spend 20 or 30 minutes in the grocery store. Next slide, please. And one really interesting study, and this garden is the exact garden that these participants were asked to walk in. It's up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So they walked in this garden. So they asked them to do two different walks. One was in this garden, one was in an urban setting. And then they asked them to perform a memory test. What they found is the ones who walked in the nature setting, that their memory, their short-term memory and working memory definitely improved. The ones who worked in the urban setting, there was no improvement whatsoever. And also, their positive attitude increased once they walked in the nature setting, as opposed to walking in an urban setting. Next slide, please. So you'll often hear in some of the newer research, you'll hear the terms blue-green spaces. So blue, they're talking about water. Green, they're talking about land, whether it's trees or a garden. So just to kind of give you a little bit of context of what these mean. So with COVID, we have all been climbing the walls. Everyone was on lockdown. We couldn't go to our state parks. A lot of places were just shuttered. You couldn't go out. And then gradually they started opening up and allowing people to walk into the parks, to go to your city park, go to your county park, maybe a national park. Of what they found when they looked at individuals who had anxiety and depression issues, that if they walked in nature once a week, it had a much more calming and stress relieving attitude for them. They often did not have as many negative thoughts. They indicated that they had higher levels of happiness. What could be better? And again, this doesn't cost you anything. Next slide, please. So this was a real interesting study I saw. And this would really work well for those of who live in cities. Do you have 40 seconds? I'm sure we all have 40 seconds. One of the issues that they look at is what's called attention restoration theory. So this is when people have this sense of being away, and that it's like they take a little mini vacation. They take a small break in their day. This happens to be the picture that you're looking at, the green roof on Chicago City Hall. How do you think it would be to work for City Hall and be able to look out and see something like that? Maybe you will find, which is something I found when I was doing my master's research. I actually did it on the green roof at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I was there when we actually installed the green roof, and we were the first group of grad students who were able to do our research up there. And one of the things that was really fascinating was right across from Thompson Woods was Thompson Lake. and there was a mallard duck, and we had one section of the green roof. It was more like a prairie, so we had prairie type plants on there. The female duck flew up on the roof. She got right in the middle, and it was probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and laid her eggs. So she created her nest. She hatched her young, and then she just walked to the edge of the roof and flew down. Well, the babies jumped, much to the horror of most of us. So we actually had to stop traffic so we could get the ducks across the road over to Thompson Lake. So she valued having a really nice place to go and lay her eggs. So 40 seconds, everyone could afford to take a green micro break like this. Next slide, please. Now, this was probably one of the most interesting studies that I came across about bacteria. Usually we think of bacteria as not being something that is friendly, but Microbacterium vaccae is a bacterium that has anti-inflammatory and immunoregulatory properties. And what I found very interesting about this was they took heat-prepared preparations of this bacterium, and they injected it subcutaneous, or right under the skin of mice. Now, these mice had been traumatized, but what they found was 4 to 5 weeks after they stopped injecting them, they still were able to deal with stress-induced anxiety. Now, I think this certainly holds a lot of promise for sufferers of PTSD. In this, as you can see from the bottom, this is a very recent study. One of them was just released this year. So, this past year now. But I thought that this was very, very interesting. You know, something that is in nature. Now, I grew up on a farm in southeast Louisiana. We went barefoot all summer long, so I'm sure we were getting Microbacterium vaccae on our feet all the time. We worked in the dirt. We planted gardens, so we can get this very naturally. Next slide, please. Another issue are families. Families, just to get away from day-to-day routines, is very, very valuable. Whether you're going to go and walk the dog, take your family with you. Make it an outing where you can all go. Get away from all of our electronic gadgets, whether it's an iPad, an iPhone, or whatever type of phone you have. Just put it all down and go out and walk and talk and communicate with one another and enjoy things out in nature. Maybe you'll come across a bird or a nest or a flower or a really cool tree that you could talk about, that you could share the experience with. As this family, they're going biking. And this is actually a picture in Illinois. So put the gadgets down. Put those electronic leashes away and just take yourself and your families out into nature and create a routine of this. Do this every day for even if it's just a few minutes a day, 20 minutes. And you will basically set your attitude and help not only your well-being, but also your family's well-being. Next slide, please. Now, children absolutely benefit from being outside. One of the things I thought was kind of unusual was when they started pulling PE out of classes and you would only have like a little bit of recess time, that PE wasn't actually required anymore. But my gosh, that was great. We would get out, we would do all kinds of things. We were either playing softball, dodgeball, basketball, tennis. We were outside and we were having fun. You can tell from this group of children that they're really enjoying themselves. Children are very creative. Nature, just being out there, helps them to feel much bigger than themselves. And then for children who have attention deficit or hyperactivity disorders, this really helps to reduce those types of symptoms. So you can see there's multiple studies that have looked at this. Some of them may go back into the 2000s, but again, because this presentation was short, there was no way to include everything that was very recent. It's like you have to cut it off somewhere. Next slide, please. Look at these kids. They are having a blast out there. And what they found was that when children work together, that they talk to one another, they communicate, they collaborate. It helps to inspire and helps to give a child confidence. It helps to soothe that child as well. So all they have is a ball, but they're having a great time with the ball. For us, because we grew up in Louisiana, we had lots of pine trees. We would often take the pine straw that would fall, we would rake it up, and we would create a house. We would have sort of like our own little floor plan, and we would divide it all up. And that's the way we did a lot of creative play. But this really helps children learn to get along and to foster some imagination, that they don't have to have that iPad and everything. All they have to do is get out there and enjoy themselves. Next slide, please. Nature really benefits all of us. The biggest takeaway from this is it increases our overall well-being. You can just walk down the street. You can go and sit on a park bench. You can find a quiet place where it's just you and it's just what's around, and you can get away from everything. And it gives you a very calming effect, that your problems, you don't have to bring them with you to the park or on your walk. You leave those things behind and go and spend this time with yourself or with a loved one or with your family, and just enjoy being together and just enjoy being able to do something that's not the same old every day. It also can increase your confidence. It also increases your self-image of yourself. You feel so much better. Next slide, please. So now I would say probably none of us we're not ready to leap and go outside right now. But when we have gone through this slight thaw, grab your boots or shoes or go barefoot if that's what you want. Get your family, your friends, please take the dog, or if you have a cat, take the cat too if the cat will walk. Take water, take snacks, go outside. Enjoy being outside. Your well-being and the well-being of all of those who are with you are waiting for you to come and enjoy it. So what you should do is you should get out there and you should just enjoy being in nature. So, next slide, please. This is my contact information. If you would like to know anything more, I would be more than happy to answer your questions if possible. Last slide, Jiminy, please. Well, there's one more. Here's some of our other recordings. If you would like to go back through and visit them. So it's go.illinois.edu for Four Seasons recordings. And at the end of this, if you have your cell phones, we have a QR code. We would like to ask you if you would take a brief survey. The reason this is very important is it helps us to bring programming that is valuable to you, so we can see what your responses are, and if you have any suggestions, they're always helpful.